Hi everyone, welcome back to lecture 9. So in this part of the lecture, what we're going to do is talk just very quickly about some general strategies that you can use when you're doing natural deduction proofs. Now, it's worth noting right at the start that the very best way to get better at doing proofs is just a lot of practice. Right? This is going to sound slightly ironic, given that we're supposed to be doing, logic, super rigorous and everything, but proof construction is often more an art than it is a science. It's something that as you get more experience doing, you will become better and better at it. You start to see how the rules fit together and ways you can play them that will make you able to do things that you probably couldn't easily see or do before. So it's a bit like playing a really complex board game. As you start to play it more and more and more, right, you figure out how to make the combination and win the game in one move. So insert your favorite Magic or Yu-Gi-Oh references here. So I want to just talk about 4 basic strategies that we can use when we're constructing proofs that are universally helpful. So our first one, right, is basically to work backwards. So what do I mean by this? So the idea here is, right, when you're doing a proof, you always know what your assumptions are and you know what your conclusion is. So the first thing to do, and in fact, if you look at the examples we talked about in the previous part and did this, was we look at the conclusion and we ask of the conclusion, what's the rule I'm likely going to have to use to get me this? What's the final step of this proof probably going to be? And the big clue here is the sentence's main operator. If the sentence has a conjunction as its main operator, it's a pretty good guess that your last step is going to be conjunction introduction. If it's negation, it's going to be negation introduction. If it's a conditional, conditional introduction. Not always the case, but usually the case that your last step is going to involve introducing that sentence's main operator, because that's what's going to give you that sentence on your proof line. So if you know that, then you kind of know, right, what your last step's going to be. And of course, if this is going to be your last step, then you can think, well, what am I going to need on my proof line in order to do that last step? If it's conjunction introduction, say, what will I need? Well, I need to have derived the 2 conjuncts on my proof line above here. And now what we can do is basically continue to do this same step working backwards. Cool. This is going to be my final step. It's going to use this rule. If I'm going to use that rule, my proof needs to have these elements. So what steps am I going to need to do to get these elements? Okay. How am I going to get these? Well, let's look at their sentence. Let's look at these sentences. Let's think about their main operators. Again, it's probably going to be some kind of introduction rule featuring their main operators. So now we're starting to structure the proof as we move backwards. So for example, think about the sample proofs that we talked about, proving, say, that G and not G are provably equivalent. Now, one of them, when I went from G to the quadruple not G, I talked about the idea that, right, because quadruple not G has negation as its main operator, it's likely that my last step is going to be negation introduction. So that meant then that I was going to structure the proof by starting it effectively with a subproof where I assume triple not G, try and derive a contradiction, and then once I've done that, I can introduce my negation. So this is the same idea. Look at your conclusion. Ask, what rule will I likely need to use to get it? Then think about how you would structure your proof, what you need in order to do that rule. Ask about those sentences that you'll need. How will I get these? What will be the rules to use to give me these? And then keep repeating until you've worked your way back all the way to the assumptions, or at least you can kind of start to see a pathway. This working backwards works really well with a second strategy, which is work with what you've been given. Right? Shake what your mama gave you. Right? So the idea here is start off by looking at your assumptions. Think about what their main operators are, right? Note them down. and then consider the relevant elimination rules. What if you applied your various elimination rules to your assumptions? What's that going to give you? Right? Similarly, consider relevant introduction rules. What could you apply to the assumptions? What's that going to give you? Think about the options that are kind of before you by just simply applying elimination and introduction rules to the stuff you start with. This settles what your first steps are, and it helps you know where you can go right off the bat. Now this is really handy because again, it kind of spells out like, cool, like, I know what my possible first steps are going to look like. And this works especially well if it's paired with the previous strategy. So if you take a few steps where you're looking at the conclusion, you work backwards a few ways to get like, okay, these are the kinds of things I'm going to need in my proof line to do this rule for my conclusion. Now let's jump to the assumptions and think about, okay, these are the assumptions. Here are the various possible things that I can get applying my elimination or introduction rules to them. And you start seeing stepping stones. You start seeing how, okay, cool, I can get this from the assumptions, and that's the thing that I needed to give me my last step. Oh, and now I've got my proof. Right? So it is a lot of playing around. It's a lot of trying to see where your moves are going to take you. But these two are very handy ones, right? Starting from the back and thinking about what's the final step going to have to be, and starting from the front and thinking about what your possible first steps are. What are your initial options? Now, the third strategy is a little bit more difficult, but it's extremely useful. And this is to try and prove things indirectly. So the idea here is instead of constructing a proof directly to some sentence A, we're going to show that its negation must be false. So how do we do this? Well, the idea is if you can't find a way to show that a sentence A, like to derive a sentence A, start a subproof opening with its negation. So start a subproof that starts with not A. Then inside the subproof, which has not A as its opening additional assumption, try and derive a contradiction. And if you can derive a contradiction, then you can close the subproof and, on one layer back to the left, obtain not A via negation introduction. Because what does your subproof show? Your subproof shows that if not A was true, then a contradiction would be true. We don't want contradictions to be true, so it's not the case that not A is true. That is, not A. Now the nice thing is, not A, you can then apply double negation elimination and give you A. And in so doing, what have you shown? You've shown that A has to be true. Because if its negation were true, you'd get a contradiction. So this is why it's proving A indirectly. You've proved that not A cannot be true. And if not A cannot be true, then A must be true. Now this is a trick, and it's an extremely useful trick. Because sometimes, right, it just is very hard to see how to get to A. And if we think about just doing this indirectly, like showing in a subproof that not A leads to a contradiction, the world's going to open up to you. So seeing this a couple times I think will be helpful, and we'll talk through a few cases where we can do this sort of thing. In fact, we actually did it already. If we think again about the G and quadruple not G case, that's one where we proved quadruple not G indirectly. We showed that triple not G led to a contradiction, which then allowed us to derive quadruple not G. Now we didn't need to do the double negation elimination, but it's the same basic step. Good. So the last proof strategy is by far the most important one. So you can work backwards. You can think about how to start from the front, figure out what your first steps are. You can use this sort of proving things indirectly. But probably the most useful advice I can give you about proofs is to just persist. Don't give up. Right? If things aren't working, try something different. Think about trying to do it indirectly. Start again by thinking about from the back. Think about what you can get by just applying stuff to your initial assumptions. Right. just keep banging at it, keep trying, because there's gonna be a way to get there from here. So it's hard, and these are sorts of things. If you've never done this sort of stuff before, it's going to be a bit weird, right? But yeah, it's fun, and you can do it. So that's the important thing. Have a good time with it. Um, so those are the general strategies with regards to approaching things. Starting from the back, thinking about what your last step is going to be, and then working out what the proof's going to have to look like from there. Starting from the front and thinking about what your first initial options are, trying to prove things indirectly by showing that a sentence's negation leads to a contradiction, thereby deriving its double negation, and hence deriving it, and then just simply not giving up. Straightforward, bullheaded persistence. These are going to get you through pretty much everything that you're going to have to do. So, good. That's basically it with regards to general proof strategies. Now what we're going to do in the coming weeks is we're going to do a whole bunch of these in tutorials. We're going to talk a lot about how these proofs work. We'll do practice proofs together. There's a lot of exercises in the book if you want to practice. And yeah, I think there'll be plenty of time to get kind of familiar with it. But that's basically it. That's the introduction to natural deduction for TFL. Which of course means what we're going to do next is natural deduction for first order logic. Now this is where we actually get our money's worth. Because you'll note when we were talking a little bit about the proof theoretic notions, there is this lovely kind of parallel between what we can define in terms of the single turn style and the stuff we can define in terms of the double turn style. Now I'm going to spoil my own lecture in about 2 weeks' time, but the parallels perfectly match each other in that every time we can use an interpretation, so we're thinking about first order logic, to do something, and we said, oh, we can't use interpretations to show these things because then we need to think about all possible interpretations. Our natural deduction system is going to take care of that. And similarly, on the flip side, everything that we said, hey, our natural deduction system can't really show us because that involves thinking about all possible proofs. Well, that's where our interpretations are going to step in. And we're going to end up with the two together with a complete logical system. So no matter what we want to do, we'll always have a way to do it, either with interpretations or with natural deduction proofs. That's the real cool payoff, and that's a neat thing. But of course, first we got to get used to our natural deduction system for first order logic. So that's going to be what we're going to do in the next lecture. We'll talk through the new rules for FOL, and it'll be good. Right. Take care, guys. Thank you very much for coming. I hope this was useful, and look forward to talking with you all again soon.